Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? That has to be one of the most haunting lyrics I've ever heard, written by the great Gordon Lightfoot, of course, for his masterpiece, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The loss of the Fitz was such a shock, partly because by then, November of 1975, we thought that shipbuilding technology and weather forecasting had advanced to a point where commercial shipping on the Great Lakes would be immune, even to the witch of November. That turned out to be a terrible case of hubris, didn't it? Probably pretty close to what led up to the sinking of the Titanic. So, lesson number 1, beware of unsinkable ships. Lesson number 2, anywhere on the Great Lakes, beware the weather that comes with the fall change of seasons, the gales of November. So far in history, best anyone knows, some 6,000 ships or more have met their demise in the Great Lakes, and they took down with them somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 30,000 sailors. Now, they didn't all sink in the month of November, but no other time of year even comes close. As recently as the last century, it wasn't uncommon for a single November storm to swallow several ships. And Lake Superior doesn't have any monopoly on deadly storms. The so-called White Hurricane of 1913 built up to its peak right around November the 10th, the same date the Fitzgerald would sink, 62 years later. That storm is still considered to be one of the deadliest, most destructive natural disasters ever to hit the Great Lakes in recorded history. That one storm killed more than 250 people, destroyed 19 ships, and stranded 19 others, with major shipwrecks all the way from Lake Superior to Lake Erie. It was Lake Huron that was hit the hardest in 1913. 8 ships lost on that lake alone in one November storm. Now, there are 2 things most shipwrecks have in common. First, they're often very sudden, so the crew has no chance to escape or even call for help. And therefore, secondly, the explanation of what went wrong is unknown. They're mysteries, with no one left to tell the tale. But this time, we're going to relive a sinking that was just as devastating as the loss of the Fitzgerald, and maybe just as sudden. But we're going to find out what really happened. It's the horrifying story of the Daniel J. Morrell. Went down in a terrible November gale on Lake Huron, leaving just one survivor who saw it all happen and just barely lived to tell about it. That's Dennis Hale, a watchman on the Morrell, and in his own words, he'll share the memory of a living nightmare.
If somebody told me that this was going to happen to me, I would have never believed them. A lot of bad memories, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. But I'm here, and that's all that really matters.
So stay with me. We're going to feel some of that wet November chill and get a rare first-person account of the terrifying demise of a Great Lakes freighter. This time on My Duluthian Life.
Let me tell you about my hometown, greatest in the Gopher State. I'll have to brag a little bit, but I really won't exaggerate. Big D-U-L-U-T-H, Duluth, Duluth. That's my hometown, Duluth, Duluth. That's my
hometown. So, what's in this witch's brew, the gales of November? Well, you take cold, dry air from northern Canada and run it up against warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. When they collide, you might say, the Great Lakes are just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The result is one of nature's most unpredictable weather patterns. Wind speeds easily reach or exceed 60 miles an hour. Waves look like something from the angriest of oceans. But Great Lakes gales make waves that are steeper and closer together than typical ocean waves because the lakes don't have the sheer mass of the ocean to absorb all that wind energy. Seas often build up to somewhere around 25 or 30 feet. But then there are the rogue waves. Totally unpredictable. They come from out of nowhere, traveling in sets of 2 or 3 for some reason, and they can be nearly double the size of the wave train around them. Some witnesses say they've topped 50 feet. And the colder the water, the more dense. A gallon of cold water weighs more than a gallon of warm. So what does a wall of water, the size of a 5-story building, and probably just as heavy, do when it hits a ship? That's hard to predict. But my dad talks about storms that hit his ships with waves that bent solid metal bulwarks and flattened the steel bars supporting the deck lights. You might remember Gordon Lightfoot's lyric, "At 7 p.m. a main hatchway caved in." But now a little trivia, that was written before the wreck, lying on the bottom of Lake Superior, could be studied in detail. Lightfoot later changed the lyric for his newer live performances because it doesn't appear that's really what happened. The problem is, we don't know for sure exactly what did happen. Nobody lived to tell about it. And so it goes with many thousands of Great Lakes shipwrecks over the centuries. They're mysterious. Lots of ships just vanished, never made it to any port, for reasons nobody may ever know. There's a common pattern among Great Lakes shipwrecks. The numbers grow exponentially as the shipping season draws to a close. The owners of the fleets and their crews are keen to see if they can make just one more trip and get one more payday before they call it quits for the year. And that, more often than not, entails tempting the witch. That's exactly what was happening when the Daniel J. Morrell, owned by the Cambria Steamship Co, was unloading taconite pellets in Lackawanna, New York, right near Buffalo. It was November the 26th, 1966, almost exactly 9 years before the Fitzgerald would go down. The Morrell had been scheduled for layup, but then the Cambria office got word that a load of iron ore pellets was due to go out of Taconite Harbor on Minnesota's North Shore, and the carrier scheduled to pick up that load was having engine trouble and couldn't make it. So the front office decided to change the Morrell's orders and send her to Taconite Harbor. There was a minor glitch, however. 2 of the Morrell's crew decided they had time for a quick visit with family near Lackawanna: the watchman, Dennis Hale, and a deckhand, John Grow. But when they returned to the dock, they found the Morrell had sailed on schedule without them. Not wanting to miss their year-end bonuses, those 2 guys made arrangements to meet the boat when she stopped for fuel near Windsor, Ontario. So after a fairly frantic road trip, Hale and Grow made it to Windsor and caught their ship. It was 7 a.m., November the 28th, when they boarded. Now, the Morrell had a sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, virtually identical, but 1 foot longer, 603 feet, and the biggest ship on the Great Lakes when she was launched within just a few days of the Morrell in 1906. The Townsend was built right here in Superior, and the Morrell was launched by a shipbuilder over in Michigan. Both ships were considered technological and engineering marvels, bigger and faster than anything on the lakes at the time. The Townsend figures into this because she was headed the same place as the Morrell, Taconite Harbor. After the Morrell fueled up, taking on a little over 200 tons of coal in Windsor, both ships headed north, out of the Detroit River, across Lake St. Clair, and onto Lake Huron. The Townsend was not far behind the Morrell. There was just a moderate westerly wind that morning, but the forecast raised a bit of concern, and the two captains conferred by radio. By 10 o'clock that night, the wind had shifted into the north, 50 miles an hour, and the seas had built to 12 feet. The captains spoke again on the radio. Both were having trouble holding their courses. They talked about the idea of taking refuge somewhere along the eastern shore of Michigan State. There were a couple of good options. On a third ship, the skipper was listening in on the radio conversation. He had just passed an island chain farther north off Thunder Bay, Michigan, not to be confused with Thunder Bay, Ontario. And he was advising the captains of both the Morrell and the Townsend about ships that were already anchored up there, taking shelter behind those islands just off Alpena, Michigan. It was becoming a horrific storm. The winds were shifting from northwest to northeast, making the west side of Lake Huron the downwind one, exposed to seas that had the whole width of the lake to build up. By midnight, its estimated winds were approaching 70 miles an hour, with steep, icy cold seas running up to about 30 feet. The captain of the Townsend would later say this was the worst weather he had ever seen on the Great Lakes. And eventually he abandoned the idea of reaching the Thunder Bay Islands and instead headed slowly, directly into the waves and wind to ride out the storm. The two skippers never spoke again, but it appears the Morrell continued north, hoping to reach the shelter of those islands. Now, as a kid, sailing with my dad on the same kind of ships as the Townsend and Morrell, we were only in one bad storm while I was aboard. And that was also on Lake Huron. It started one fine, sunny afternoon, but pretty soon the waves were overflowing onto the deck. Dad closed the big steel doors to his quarters, and by nightfall, we were rolling in waves that washed against the portholes of his office, a good 25 feet above the waterline. Mom stayed in the bathroom, sick as a dog. Dad tied me into one of his office chairs with a towel. On the heavier rolls, Mom would holler from the bathroom, "Oh my God, we're gonna sink!" Dad would let out a somewhat forced chuckle each time and say, "Oh, we're not gonna sink." After all, he'd been in lots of storms and they never sank. The scariest thing I can remember is what I was hearing. The metallic sound of steel, groaning, twisting under the strain. Sometimes there were loud pinging sounds, very loud. I would look at Dad "Rivets," was all he said. "That's normal." He was talking about steel rivets, the size of my wrists, shearing off as the ship's steel plates worked back and forth in those waves. Once in a while, you'd feel a sudden jolt, and everything in his office would shake and rattle like crazy. The engine, right below his quarters, was racing. That's just the prop coming out of the water, Jim. No big deal." "Oh, sure, no big deal." Well, enough damage was done to that boat in that storm that night that she had to go to dry dock for repairs after that trip. But we made it, all in one piece. That is, very tragically, not how it went on board the Morrell. And we have the words, the first-person story, of somebody who was on board the night of November 28th in 1966, thanks to an award-winning photojournalist and filmmaker for the Detroit Free Press, Eric Seals. In 2015, he was making a documentary about shipwrecks and managed to get an incredible interview with Dennis Hale, that watchman who just barely caught up with the Morrell for that trip. Dennis had refused to talk about his nightmare experience for many decades. But finally, at age 74, he opened up in this interview.
I climbed aboard the Morrell November 28th, 1966, at about 7 o'clock in the morning. Sometime later that night, I was awakened by a loud bang. I rolled over onto my right side, facing one of the bulkheads, and about the same time, there was another loud bang, and all the books came off my bookcase at that point. As I opened my door, Al Wimmy was coming out of his door, and he said, "Oh my God, oh my God." And I said, "What is it, Al? What's going on?" As I looked towards the stern, I couldn't see the stern. The stern was hogged. I could see lights coming up where the stern would have been, but no stern.
In shock and disbelief, Dennis and his shipmate watched the Morrell, bending wildly in the middle, snaking up and down in the waves. And then she just started coming apart.
She was starting to tear, and it tore real slow like a piece of paper, and you could see sparks coming from it as it tore, and then the two sections separated.
The forward end had lost power, but all the lights were still on back aft, including the cargo lights in the empty holds. The engine went right on running, pushing the back half of the ship forward.
Somehow, the stern section came abreast of the bow section, and from where I was sitting on the bow section, I could look straight into the cargo hold. It was an oh shit moment. It was just so surreal. Am I really seeing this happen to me? What's going to happen? Is that going to come over us and wipe us all off the raft and kill us? Is it going to ram into us? I had no idea. But that's not what happened.
The forward end crew struggled to hang on and wade through waist-deep water that was crashing across the deck. They went toward the life raft that sat between hatches, a short way back from their cabins. Several of the crew, including the captain, made it to the raft. But then...
I think we were hit by a large wave, and everybody was thrown overboard. By the time I got to the raft, there were two other fellas on it, and they helped boost me aboard. And then another fella came aboard. We helped boost him aboard. We went through the waves all night. And that 65-mile-an-hour wind would hit you at 33 degrees. The first thing you would hear is everybody gasping for air. Me, all I did out there was pray, and I prayed to die.
On ships like the Morrell, all the power was generated in the engine room. So when she broke up, there was no power in the pilot house anymore for the radios. No power to even send a distress call. So nobody in the world, except the guys on that raft, knew what was happening. And that may even include the engine crew, at least at first. The stern section went right on steaming across the lake. In fact, at one point, Dennis thought they might have sighted a ship in the distance, but realized eventually that it was actually the stern half of his own boat running along at a distance off into the night. It would be discovered many years later that the back half of the Morrell traveled on for another hour and a half and then finally sank beneath the waves 5 miles away from the bow section. Meanwhile, the Townsend was pressing on, making barely 3 miles an hour, driving straight into the enormous seas and shrieking wind. The captain tried calling the Morrell twice, the last time around 3:45 a.m. No reply. He figured maybe they'd lost an antenna or something. For everybody out on that lake, the night seemed like an eternity. And as morning came, November 29th, the storm was still raging. For the men on that raft, reality only grew increasingly desperate. Dennis Hale still dressed, only in boxer shorts, a pea coat, and his life jacket.
By dawn, I looked at the kid in front of me, John Cleary, and there was like a white foam coming out of his mouth. And I jabbed him. I said, John, I said, are you okay? Are you all right? And he didn't respond to me. So I jabbed him again. I said, John. Called his name out several times. Didn't respond to me. Art Stojek was behind me. I took my elbow and I jabbed him with my elbow. I said, Art, are you okay? He didn't respond either. I jabbed him several times and called his name. No response. Charles Foshbender was behind my legs. And I kicked him. I said, Fuzzy, I said, are you okay? He says, yeah, I'm hanging in there.
The 29th of November would be a day of misery for Dennis Hale. The sun never shone through the clouded sky. Just more wind and the incessant splashing of 40-degree lake water over his bare legs. As darkness approached once again, the thought of enduring another night out there on that raft became unbearable.
You go through what's called a loss of faith syndrome out there, where you just, you don't care what the end is. You don't care if you live or die. You just want it over with. And all the time I was out there, that was a constant companion that you just don't care.
By the time the morning of November 30th dawned, concern for the Morrell was growing. She had still not arrived at Sault Ste. Marie and the locks leading into Lake Superior. There were no sightings, on radar or otherwise, by other ships. Radio calls from company headquarters went unanswered. But by then, the raft with Dennis aboard was drifting toward shore.
After a while, I felt Fuzzy moving again, Charlie Foshbender. He says, I can see the beach. He said, there's nothing but forest there. He says, a lot of big rocks in the water, a lot of big boulders. He says, it won't be long until you can feel the bottom of the raft hitting on the beach. And he sounded kind of strange. And I said, are you okay? He says, he says, feels like my lungs are starting to fill up. I said, well, can't you cough that stuff out? Well, he started coughing and he passed away. And he fell with his arm around me. I looked at John Cleary, and he was encased in ice. And I went a little berserk. And I got up on my elbow and raised my fist to the sky and cussed God, the Holy Family, and told them all to go to hell, that I could make it on my own. And I laid back down and started chipping some of the ice off of John. I guess it was an act of love, envy, compassion, every emotion I had.
Does anyone know where the love of God goes? The raft beached in just a couple of feet of water, but by then, Dennis was drifting in and out of consciousness. He was too weak to even move. He heard some seagulls and imagined it was a rescue helicopter at first, but then he realized it was just some scavenger birds who'd taken an interest in the corpses beside him. He had a vision of an old white-haired man in flowing robes wading in toward the beached raft. This figure that Dennis nicknamed Doc warned him against eating the ice he was chipping off his lifeless shipmate, said it could lower his body temperature. And then Dennis recalls a visit to the afterlife. He described it as a warm, green, lush valley where he felt love all around him. There was a bridge that he crossed, and there he met his mother. She had died giving birth to him, so he said they didn't have very much to talk about. He asked about his shipmates, and someone told him, yes, they're here, at the bottom of this hill. He rushed down toward them, but then the third assistant engineer from the Morrell came up and stopped him. Dennis Hale was no doubt dying, but the engineer said, no, it's not your time, Dennis. You have to go back. By now, it was just about noon, November the 30th, and the Morrell was long overdue at Taconite Harbor. A quick check confirmed she'd not even made it through the Sioux Locks up onto Lake Superior. So, at last, an all-points bulletin went out, and a frantic search began. The Morrell was missing and feared lost. It took only about 4 more hours before a Coast Guard helicopter crew looked down along the Lake Huron shore and, in the light of late afternoon, spotted that bright orange raft with people on it. It was beached in about 18 inches of water, and a second helicopter was called in.
Prepare positions, Sandy Gray, Golf, Romeo, 664.
Dennis said he thought at first it might just be those seagulls coming back again, but no, this time the helicopters were real.
And I looked up and I saw it, and I waved to them. And I saw them land in the water on the beach. And 2 of the Coast Guardsmen got out of the helicopter and walked over to me, picked me up, and laid me on top of one of the other bodies on my back. And the first thing I said to them is, I love you guys, where the hell you been?
Up at the Sioux Locks, the Townsend did make it in safely. But word was traveling fast that a survivor from the Morrell was found, and he said she'd broken in 2. The captain walked the decks of this sister ship, and right next to hatch number 10, he looked down and saw a crack in the steel deck, just about exactly where the Morrell had torn apart. On December 2nd, an inspector from the Coast Guard boarded the Townsend and found several signs that the hull had been compromised around the midsection. She was declared unfit for duty and ordered to lay up for the season then and there at the Sioux. Dennis Hale, meanwhile, was still nowhere close to recovery.
Well, they landed at Harbor Beach, Michigan, on one of the docks there. And then they drove me to Harbor Beach Community Hospital. I was blue when they brought me in. They didn't know if I was going to make it or not. And priest came in and gave me last rites of the church, as well as confession. Well, actually, I had confession 3 times that night. I figured if I was going to go, I wanted my slate clean. It took years before I had all the feeling back in my legs and feet. Since then, I've had like 13 surgeries on my left foot. All I have on my left foot is a big toe. The other toes have been amputated, as well as the outside of my foot.
With 28 lives lost out of a crew of 29, the Morrell sinking became the subject of intensive investigation. She was built of what's called high-sulfur steel, the same as the Titanic and nearly all ships up until 1948, when better alloys were developed. To picture what happens to a ship working its way through steep waves, take a paper clip, straighten it out, and start bending it back and forth, back and forth. How long can you keep that up until it just snaps in two? Upon further inspection, the Townsend was declared a total loss. She could never sail again. The authorities issued a long list of recommendations and requirements. For one thing, ships would have to have backup power on the forward end, so radios and other safety equipment would work, even if broken off from the engine room. There was plenty of time to send a mayday call from the Morrell, just no electrical power to do it. Ships would also have to carry inflatable-type life rafts that were easy to launch and had a canopy to protect survivors from the elements, and the list goes on. Dennis Hale spent 3 months in that hospital in Harbor Beach, but made a full recovery. He would never sail again, but lived to age 75 before he died of cancer. Not very long before his death, he said this.
It's funny the way life treats you sometimes. If somebody told me that this was going to happen to me, I would have never believed them. A lot of bad memories, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering. But I'm here, and that's all that really matters.
The stern section of the Daniel J. Morrell was found just 38 days after she sank in about 200 feet of water, 18 miles north of a place called Port Austin, off the thumb of Michigan State's Mitten. But the Morrell's bow, where Dennis cast off in that raft, that wouldn't be found for another 12 years. It was 5 miles away. As for the Edward Y. Townsend, built in Superior, Wisconsin, she was sold for scrap to a company in Spain. But then, starting into the Atlantic, under tow by a sea tug with no one aboard the Townsend, they hit rough weather, howling winds, steep seas. They made it just about 400 miles off the Newfoundland coast when, without any warning, the Townsend just suddenly snapped in two and sank. I like to think it was a more dignified ending for a noble ship, to escape being taken apart piece by piece in a scrapyard. No. The Townsend went down and settled to the bottom, not far from another legendary ship made of the same kind of steel, no less, and which also sunk in the same place, 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. Yeah, the Townsend went down to join the company of a somewhat younger ship on the Atlantic Ocean floor, the RMS Titanic.
Duluth, Duluth, that's my hometown. Duluth, Duluth, that's my hometown.
My Duluthian Life with Jim Hayden is produced monthly by Planet Pictures Media. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts.